Hello, everybody. My name is Weston Livingood. I'm a junior in the Tickle College of Engineering, and I'm currently studying mechanical engineering. Around campus, I'm involved in the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and I participate in campus ministry. As well, I'm from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Today, we're going to be discussing the impact of fertilizers on water quality, and right here we have the outline for how I'm going to order this presentation. First of all, we're going to talk about the general history and purpose of fertilizer. And then next, we're going to talk about how fertilizer actually works. And with that, we're going to outline inorganic and organic fertilizers, kind of discuss what they're good at, how they're different. And then next, we're going to talk about eutrophication and its consequences. And with that, we'll discuss how it begins, what it does, and just get into the nitty-gritty of that. Next, we're going to talk about nitrate contamination, which, if you didn't know, in fertilizer, there's nitrogen, and a byproduct of that is nitrate, and it creates a lot of contamination issues in our water, and that's just a really important thing to kind of reflect over. Next, we're going to talk about animal and human effects, kind of looking at how we are affected, both socially, economically, and from a health perspective. And lastly, we're going to take a quick look at an economic impact of fertilizers. So first of all, fertilizer has been around for a very long time. The first original uses can be dated back to the Egyptians and Babylonians. And if you didn't know, both of these civilizations were kind of known for their farming practices and being kind of the first go-getters at irrigation and becoming really effective with their agriculture. And so with that kind of stated, I'd like to mention that the purpose of fertilizer is to provide 17 essential nutrients to soil. And just to name a few of those, there's phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium. And not just from like a nutritional standpoint, but fertilizer is really good at maintaining the health of the soil, because after a consistent farming period or monsoons, rainstorms, soil kind of becomes damaged, and that affects agricultural productivity. And another big reason that fertilizer is really important is that its usage has been correlated with economic growth and productivity. And just to name one statistic I was able to find, in the country of Afghanistan, there was a net profit increase of $2.25 million in just a year. So that's quite a lot of money. All right, so with like a brief history and purpose of fertilizer kind of explained and reflected on, we're going to go into how it actually works. So three main nutrients are phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium. First of all, nitrogen kind of helps out with the actual growth of plants from like stem, leaves, and then phosphorus really helps with root health. So as you guys probably know from like high school biology, roots are really important for taking in nutrients and water. So roots are kind of a heavy hitter as far as the plant goes. So that's very important that they receive their phosphorus. And next, potassium helps defend against disease and just generally improves their overall health. So fertilizer brings three key nutrients that are crucial. And with that explained, I think it's appropriate next to talk about inorganic fertilizer versus organic. So organic fertilizers, as the name suggests, are completely natural. They're not made in a lab. And this may sound like a downside to it, but one advantage of organic fertilizers is they very slowly release their nutrients into the soil. So if you're trying to grow crops over a long period of time, it allows them to grow over a long period of time. And that kind of helps with agricultural planning and just in general that. And as well, they are cheaper than inorganic fertilizers. Inorganic fertilizers are completely synthetic and almost have like the opposite side effects and positives to it. They're cheaper, they don't last as long, which if you're trying to produce a yield of crops really quickly, that's great. But if you're trying to sustain it over time, not so great. And one big thing about inorganic fertilizers is they're very easy to store. So with that explained, going to briefly talk about engineering roles in fertilizers. Most of us, I believe, are mechanical engineers. We kind of help with creating technologies such as drones, tractors, which is pretty instrumental in distributing fertilizer. Environmental engineering, stewarding the environment, making sure everything's healthy, that we're not using too much inorganic fertilizer or anything of that sorts. And industrial engineering, also known as systems engineering, they're really responsible for kind of optimizing these systems, finding ways to improve and analyze the data. So in the introduction, I briefly talked about eutrophication. Now I'm going to explain what eutrophication actually is. So eutrophication is a process that's characterized by excessive plant and algal growth. Now, what I mean by that is if you look at a body of water and you see a ton of green stuff, algae, that is most likely a consequence of eutrophication. And so eutrophication occurs when too much carbon dioxide, sunlight, or nutrients is brought into an ecosystem. And that basically causes too much photosynthesis. So algae starts kind of growing out of control. So on the surface level, eutrophication kind of sounds like a positive thing because more plants are going to be growing and they're going to become bigger. However, there are a lot of consequences to this process, and a couple of them include reducing water clarity and quality and attracting too much phytoplankton, raising the pH of water, and depleting dissolved oxygen in the system. Now, changing the chemical composition of water is generally not a good thing. Like, for example, in certain animals, they rely on chemical sensing abilities. So when the pH is way too high, they're not able to actually hunt their prey. And obviously, phytoplankton, too much of it makes a place smell terrible. If you've ever been to a water treatment plant, they use phytoplankton to actually consume waste. So generally not a good smell. Next, I'd like to briefly reflect on how overusing fertilizer affects humans and animals. A lot of communities rely on groundwater for drinking water, irrigation, public water supply, and feeding livestock. And a presence of too much fertilizer has the ability to kind of toxify the ecosystem. And because of that, in fishing communities where they rely on shellfish and other forms of seafood, these fishes actually become toxic to eat. So that kind of creates a lot of negative consequences from that. And that affects both humans and animals. As for the last kind of biological and chemical process that is a negative consequence of fertilizers, we have nitrate contamination. So as I was talking about earlier, one of the key ingredients of fertilizer is nitrogen, and with a lot of nitrogen, it becomes oxidized, and the oxidized version of nitrogen is nitrate. So nitrate typically occurs in water and ground soil, and just from the runoff of fertilizer. And in humans specifically, an overabundance in nitrate in the ecosystem causes negative effects to the kidneys, the spleen, the thyroids, and even causes a syndrome known as blue baby syndrome, which is where nitrogen depletes oxygen in a baby's bloodstream. And because of that, their skin starts turning blue. And obviously, oxygen not being in the bloodstream is very dangerous for anybody. So lastly, I'd like to kind of look over the economic impacts of fertilizer. In just the United States, the United States is the third largest fertilizer consumer in the world, and we produce 11% of the total fertilizer. Additionally, we contribute $140 billion to our GDP in just fertilizer, and 500,000 people are employed just because of fertilizer. And these people who are employed make $36 billion a year in total. And just some consequences on the actual economy because of fertilizer. We have environmental damage. Obviously, we got to spend money to repair the environment. If there's been too much inorganic fertilizer in an area, or if there's been a fertilizer runoff, that gets expensive because you need to take care of the environment. And then health costs, because people get sick because of fertilizer, and we can actually become too dependent on imports of fertilizer, which strains our economy. All right. Overall, fertilizer is a very important tool. However, there are some things to keep in mind. It's not all perfect, but thank you guys for listening. Any questions?
Yeah, I got one. You mentioned organic and inorganic fertilizer earlier, kind of on equal footing. What's the main difference there in how they get used? Like what style of farms, maybe family versus corporate farms, use which and when and why?
So it kind of depends on what the goal is in mind. Like in a farm, if you say take like a rural community that exclusively eats food from their farms, they don't go to the grocery store, it might be more effective to use, say, inorganic fertilizer if they need to produce a set amount of crops immediately, simply because inorganic fertilizer kind of works in the soil faster than organic. But that does come with health risks because inorganic fertilizer makes the soil less healthy, and like I was talking about earlier, contaminates food sources with nitrate. So there's just a big trade-off between the two. As for like farming styles, I think they can be used both for the same purpose. It just more differs on the time frame that it takes. Thank you.